There are a few things all people who love consuming fictional stories share the love of. The satisfaction of seeing your fantasies come true, whether it be the fantasy of a last stand against extremely overwhelming odds, or be it the fantasy of being in the center of a love triangle, or just the simple fantasy of accepting yourself for who you really are. Some people love how the medium uses its unique language to convey its message, like how a novel uses the simple words to tell complicated stories, how a movie or TV series uses visuals to tell its subtext, or how a game uses gameplay to achieve ludonarrative resonance, or simply how a painting uses colors to invoke different reactions and feelings, and so on and so on. But there is one thing all these people love the most. It's deconstructing, or at least making deconstructive criticism. Deconstruction in philosophy means a loosely defined set of approaches to understanding the relationship between text and meaning. But that's not what we are talking about here. Deconstructive criticism is a type of criticism that prioritizes pointing out the faults without recommending a way to make the product any better. We all know this one and probably do it ourselves. That's not realistic. This was lazy writing, etc., without providing any insight to how you think this piece of media could be better. But of course, deconstruction isn't limited to individual comments, and we see this in media a lot too. Sometimes it's just taking one part of a typical story and leaving the rest alone, and sometimes it's making your whole story about how the genre is wrong or mostly stupid and bad. These kinds of stories have always been around, but lately they have been somewhat on the rise because of moral fatigue and whatnot. The problem with making a deconstructionist story is that since it's about showing faults instead of providing a good way to mend the problems, its influence will probably be limited as well. Stories like Hot Fuzz or Watchmen might affect their genres or make big bucks, but they will never be Big Lebowski's or Long Halloweens, where the media is both great, beloved, and adds a lot to its main critique, so much so that their effects can be felt even decades later. But there are rare times when the deconstructionist media does something so good, they change their respective fields irreversibly. The biggest and easiest example is of course Don Quixote, but that being a novel, a very long one at that too, I wanted to talk about the next best example of this: the good, the bad, and the ugly. For those who don't know, The Good, the Bad and the Ugly is a spaghetti western movie directed by the late Sergio Leone and stars such legends as Clint Eastwood, Eli Wallach, and Lee Van Cleef. Released in 1966, it tells the story of three cowboys, the nameless cowboy simply nicknamed Blondie, the Mexican outlaw with a big bounty on his head, Tuco, and the ruthless but calculated gunslinger Angel Eyes. We follow these cowboys as they try to make their way to a buried treasure of untold riches. If you haven't watched this movie or other westerns, you might be thinking, how is this a deconstruction? It's literally every cowboy movie ever. And yeah, my summary does sound like that, but of course a summary like that doesn't do this movie any justice at all. So before we dive into this masterpiece of a movie, be warned, this video will feature a lot of spoilers. So like I said, we follow these three cowboys as they make their way to this treasure with tons and tons of money and gold. Again, this sounds very cliche, but where one would imagine John Wayne fighting the evil natives so he can help a family in need with the treasure, or a United States soldier keeping the treasure away from enemies of the state, or generally a movie where you might think of United States good, others bad stories, where the protagonist is almost inarguably the good guy and on the side of the United States military. This movie doesn't do any of that at all. Even though this movie calls Blondie the good, Angel Eyes the bad, Tuco the ugly, the lines are actually pretty blurry. All three characters are just out for themselves, They do not have any higher morals, they do not support a cause, they aren't even loyal or honorable to each other. Tuco and Blondie are always trying to convince each other to spill the beans so they can murder each other and keep the treasure all for themselves. And Angel Eyes fucking tortures them to get the info. All three backstab and try to kill each other again and again and again for the whole movie. And this, playing it dirty, doesn't end with how they treat each other. It also extends to how they fight too. Angel Eyes ambushes the others multiple times. Tuco uses his other friends as bait to be killed so he can ambush Blondie. And Blondie sneakily unloads Tuco's gun so he later on can't kill him. Compare that to previous westerns where most of the time the hero fights mostly fair and doesn't engage unless provoked, or simply has to fight the evil guy to prevent them from doing evil. So we get it. This movie deconstructs the classic westerns by deconstructing the romanticized version of the Wild West, but the western is much more than just cool guys shooting each other, and so is this movie. Because The Good, the Bad and the Ugly touches on almost everything that makes a western, well, a western. And what is a western if not barely disguised United States propaganda? Well, like I said before, a lot of westerns are about US good, others bad. And since westerns are mostly about gunslingers, these movies also dip their toes into military propaganda. By showing the soldiers and allies of US as honorable warriors doing the right thing and being extremely cool doing so, they drove the US military in the same light. So how does The Good, the Bad and the Ugly tackle this? Well, by picking the first war, which the US population doesn't see as justified and heroic, but mostly as senseless bloodshed. The US Civil War. The Good, the Bad and the Ugly takes place as the Civil War rages on. And unlike most westerns, this time Civil War isn't just the backdrop to the whole story, or something that is important to the story, but itself doesn't change the story as it happens. No, instead our gunslingers tackle with the Civil War as much as they tackle with each other. Both the Civil War and its battles are essential to this story. The whole story revolves around a Confederate soldier's treasure. Blondie and Tuco get captured by the Union soldiers. They seek refuge in a church that is providing medical assistance to both sides. Blondie survives Tuco's ambush because the battle nearby destroys the makeshift gallop, and Angel Eyes infiltrates Union ranks to get to the soldier who knows where the treasure is. There is a whole lot of these scenes, but you get the point. Now you might be thinking, US Civil War is probably the first war US waged that has a clear good and evil side. How can that tackle the US military good angle? And you are right, CSA was as evil as they come, but instead of focusing on the diplomatic parts of the war, this movie chooses only to show the battles and their effects. This takes the wars are good when it's justified angle of previous westerns and replaces it with no matter the politics of war, war is cruel and pointless and stupid. The best scenes to demonstrate this are probably the Battle of Branston Bridge and the Ecstasy of Gold scenes. The battle for the Branston Bridge shows how pointless and stupid wars are by showing us how both sides are willing to lose hundreds if not thousands of soldiers to keep a bridge that in the grand scheme of things is actually pretty useless, and how the commander knows this and knows how to stop this battle. Instead does as he is told because in his own words doesn't have the guts to do it. And also shows how both sides leave literally the day after the bridge is blown to pieces to fight another pointless war. Ecstasy of Gold scene shows how no matter what side you fight for, once you are dead, it doesn't matter anymore. You'll just get buried with countless other nameless soldiers and be essentially all forgotten about. So The Good, the Bad and the Ugly tackles the two biggest points of a western by showing how unrealistic or romanticized the typical western movie is. But is that just it? Of course not. A movie is always more than just its plot. And there are many minor things this movie also deconstructs. These are mostly more cinematic things than text and subtext. Like, instead of showing our characters as always clean, pretty, and with makeup on, they get dirty. Though this time in a literal sense of the word. Like, Clint Eastwood looks like he's gonna fucking die for a good 10 minutes. Instead of seeing these actors looking like a Gucci model after a fight, these characters look like, well, they came out of a fight. And this extends to extras or side characters as well. Instead of showing everyone like they have their shit together or like no disabled person exists in the US, this movie depicts disabled people, alcoholics, prisoners as you would expect them to be. And instead of focusing on these characteristics alone, these people are shown as normal people who also have these unique problems. Though again, these people are shown for a few seconds only or minutes only. They get stuck in our heads as prisoner of war, alcoholic, or disabled person. So, we now know how the good, the bad, and the ugly deconstructs the Western. But how did it come to replace the traditional Western? Well, that reason mostly lies in the fact that this movie, unlike many other deconstructionist movies, does more than just deconstruct its genre, but also adds a lot to it, and is also generally a great movie. Since a lot of this movie lies with the protagonists, it adds a much needed character focus to a genre that was mostly dominated by one archetype going through one shootout to the other. Which is pretty ironic considering the same happened with The Man with No Name after this movie. This direction also showed how important it is to have really badass characters in a western movie. Blondie's fast gun and silent demeanor, Tuco's dangerous and unpredictable actions, and Angela's calculating ruthlessness really makes this trio unforgettable and impossible not to turn into an archetype. Another much needed change is how the movie flows. Instead of the Times norm of conversation heavy, fast-ish paced movies, this movie takes its time, reveling in its beautiful cinematography that still influences great directors. The first 15 minutes is just scenery and silence as characters move, and there are many more scenes like this. Even the last duel is just basically 10 minutes of silence as we follow the gunslinger's thoughts not audibly, but by watching their actions. Instead of telling us what we need to think like most traditional westerns do, this movie lets the viewer think for themselves. It also lets us appreciate the maestro Ennio Morricone. This change also enhances the duels a lot too. Most shootouts have this silent and long build-up, letting us wonder how our characters are gonna get out of this mess, only to keep the shooting short but deadly. And by letting us build the tension in our minds, the results feel much more impressive too, even if the tension is revealed to be superficial. One of the most important additions is the music. Instead of using the traditional western music, Sergio Leone lets Ennio Morricone run wild, which really reframes a lot of this movie. I could talk about Ennio Morricone all day long, but words can no justice to the maestro, so hear for yourselves. Yeah, if you didn't know, that song in every single duel scene ever is Ennio Morricone's work and is the main theme of this movie. So in short, deconstructionist stories are mostly limited in their influence by the simple virtue of focusing on the flaws without adding much to the genre they are deconstructing. But by showing how westerns are flawed and also adding as much as it can to the genre. The good, the bad, and the ugly not only solidified its place in movie history as a masterpiece, it also changed both the westerns and movies as a whole. If you liked this video, remember to like and subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next video.